Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Every Monday, a new episode comes out. That's either an Unpacking Scholarship episode where I talk about education research in relation to CS education, or an episode where I interview a guest or multiple guests. In today's episode, I'm having a conversation with Leigh Ann DeLyser from CSforALL, and that's F-O-R, not the number. In this particular interview, we discuss the purpose for CSforALL. We also discuss considerations for leading people with different visions for or interests in CS education. We discuss the evolution and future direction of CS education. We chat about positive and negative corporate influence on education. We also think through equity from a systems perspective, and so much more. We do mention many resources in this particular episode that are listed in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com, where you'll find hundreds if not thousands of free resources, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for, where I create 100% free Scratch and Scratch Junior curricula. So make sure you check it out if you haven't. With that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Leigh Ann.
I'm Leigh Ann DeLyser, and I am the Executive Director and co-founder here at CSforALL, which is a nonprofit committed to systems change around computer science education in the United States. My personal story is a little bit longer than the organization, as you can imagine. I started my career as a high school teacher, and I taught math and a little bit of computer science on the side because the school needed me to, and I had done that in undergrad to pay for my degree, and eventually became the computer science teacher and found that I had a real love not only for helping students in my own classroom, but providing professional support to teachers as well. I was a College Board provider for the advanced placement courses. I wrote a review textbook for the APA course a lifetime ago and served on the CSTA's board of directors for a while. I figured out after not too much time that there was only so much advocacy you could do from the classroom. And I had the opportunity to go to Carnegie Mellon as first a visiting faculty member and then as a computer science PhD student, and did a degree in computer science and cognitive psychology there, studying the effect of feedback on novices learning to program. I left Carnegie Mellon and came to New York and got involved with Fred Wilson and CSNYC to launch the Academy for Software Engineering and build New York City's Computer Science for All program. And in 2016, had the joy of taking that work on the road and thinking about what it meant for this big, broad nation to build computer science education that was locally sourced and had real roots in community as a way to get to high quality implementation for every student. And I'm so glad to be here talking with you today.
So I'm curious, there's a philosophy that has kind of informed what I do. It's called curare. So it's like this continuous self-reflection of where you are in comparison to where you've been and where you want to go. And so one of the questions that I really like to ask guests is, what's something that you believed when you first began working in education that you no longer believe?
So when I first started working in education, I was 20 years old. I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And I believed the myth of meritocracy. I believed that all things being equal, that students would embrace knowledge and rise to the top. And as you can imagine, that wasn't necessarily the case. My first teaching job was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, at Stranahan High School, which was a medical science and engineering magnet school. So about a third of the kids in the school were these magnet kids who had, through privilege of preparation, tested into this magnet program. And the other 2/3 were similar to what we can call New York City neighborhood school. They were zoned for that school building because they lived within a certain mile radius of the building. And I had in my very first computer applications class, a 16-year-old student, and it took ninth grader, which basically meant at that time in Florida that he had aged out of middle school. Once you turn 16, you can't be in middle school anymore. And so they have to put you in ninth grade. And it took me about 2 months. He would come to class, he would stare at the walls. I did like little daily quizzes, and they were simple things like, how do you open an application on the computer? We're talking about computer applications. And it was really like you click on it with the mouse was the right answer. All of his quizzes and tests would be blank. And it took me about 2 months to figure out that he couldn't read. And we're not talking about like not reading on grade level. He couldn't sound out the word who. And it really opened my eyes to how preparatory privilege colors everything, not just the individual academic domain. Like, it's not that he only did poorly in his English class. Here he was in my computer applications class where we were, you know, doing word processing and spreadsheets. And because he had this other parallel challenge, it made performance in my class also really difficult for him along the way.
I'm curious, like, how does that experience inform your approach at CS4All and like the things that you do just in general?
That particular experience and all of the subsequent experiences around it, because I also taught computer programming at that school. And I taught pre-calculus at that school because I was a math teacher. And I had a blind student in geometry, which was a lot of fun. And I got to play with lots of pipe cleaners as a way to give him tactile representations of the geometric shapes. Keeps my eyes open to how the system of normalcy, of what we consider the average classroom, or what is expected practice, lets not just kids slip through the cracks. I think that that's a very passive way of saying that we've put structural barriers to any kind of level of success across the board for kids. And so the more I do work in computer science education, the more I'm asking myself, how are all of the other things contributing to the outcomes that we're seeing, as opposed to only drawing a direct line between that piece of computer science instruction and students' ability to perform well in the class, create the program, or even pass an AP exam.
So I have a question about those, like the hegemonic influences, like the structure of structures. But before like we dive into that a little bit more, I'm wondering if we could take a step back. If you were to provide like a quick elevator pitch of what CS4All is and like what do you intend to have in terms of impact on the field, like how would you describe that?
So the purpose and goal of CS4All really came out of early work at CSNYC in New York City. And in New York City, CSNYC was the original force behind New York City's computer science education efforts. In our early stages, we funded professional learning for teachers. So we brought in professional learning partners, ran PD in the summer and during school breaks, and prompted then teachers to offer computer science classes in the buildings that they were working in. And we asked questions. How's it going? Is it working? And found that the PD providers had gaps. For example, the teachers wished they focused more on assessment or that they did more around culturally relevant pedagogies. Mm-hmm. And so then we provided PD to the PD providers because we wanted our partners in New York City to be meeting the needs of the teachers and the students who are our ultimate constituents. We found that administrators often had trouble supporting teachers implementing computer science if they were not brought in early. And so when we launched CS4All, we imagined this multi-sector collaborative that would support computer science and make the field better. And so we don't do professional learning for teachers, but we support the community of professional learning providers. We help support administrator buy-in by raising awareness of the importance of computer science education. And we connect the folks from all these different sectors together and let them talk in the same room. Because if we're not listening to each other, we're going to keep trying to solve day one problems when the schools have moved on to day 360.
That's an excellent answer in terms of like you are, by providing PD to the people who are providing PD, that's a way of addressing some of those structural issues. How do you identify which structural issues to address, like the challenges?
We address those structural barriers and challenges through community participation. CS4All believes that the landscape knows the best what the landscape needs. And so we not only participate in the community as providers of strategic planning through our script workshops, we also participate as learners. We listen to, and we use that as a way to initiate thematic reports. For example, we're going to come out with a report on career and technical education and computer science education in a couple of months. And that really brought together a landscape of experts. We listened to them. We took lots of notes about what they said. and translated that into a sector report with recommendations. And so our strongest feature at CS4All is our membership, because not only do we expect them to contribute to the ongoing movement of CS education, we learn from them. And we learn from them where the successes are and where the gaps are, as a way to help everyone in the community get better.
So I have some ideas, like based on my understandings of different research methodologies and whatnot, but how do you or does the organization sort through what might be a signal, what might be noise, and then what's not being said in the field?
Let's be clear around methodologies of the difference between producing policy landscapes and research. We employ for a lot of our policy papers kind of a Delphi method, where you listen to experts and translate their things into the report. We're very transparent about who those voices are. And on the front end, we try as much as humanly possible to get diverse voices in the room to ensure that we're not hearing only one side of the story. But we're just not funded a level where those policy reports can rise to the same rigor as a research report. And so I want to be clear about the distinction of the two. When we do produce research through our research line, then obviously we do publications through SIGC and other venues and are very explicit about our methodology. But a lot of our landscape and policy reports are much more of this like Delphi study methodology, where we listen to experts, super transparent about who those experts are as we write it up, and build off of those themes.
Yeah, so speaking of themes, I previously did a couple of podcast episodes that was on the visions framework. So one of them was an Unpacking scholarship episode where I just kind of talked about, well, what are the different categories within this? How do some of them resonate with myself? But then I also spoke with Rafi and Sarah about this as well. And I'll include a link to those, by the way, in the show notes if anyone wants to check those out. But if you were to take the visions quiz, I'm curious, like, what values and projected impacts would kind of resonate with you? Because from an organizational standpoint, I see very clear examples where you're hitting a lot of them, but I'm curious for you as an individual, like, which ones stand out?
Thanks for the question. So my own personal bent not only changes from year to year, as I'm sure many people's do, but sits pretty much at the intersection of equity, social justice, school reform and improvement, and competencies and literacies. I grew up in rural America in a log cabin my father built, and my ability to be a successful professional, whether it be a teacher, a organization leader, a computer scientist, was entirely dependent upon me gaining the competencies and literacies that allowed me to take the jump after high school into undergraduate. And if we don't provide students with competitive transcripts at all levels for all kids, we know that it's getting increasingly hard to get into colleges, especially the top tier colleges. And so it's one more way that computer science education will become one of these differentiators of who had quality education and who did not. And so for me, that notion of competency and literacy, there's the global perspective of like computers are all around us and everybody needs them, which is super important. But it's also an important competency to create equal access for students when they exit K-12 and enter the next phase of their college or career life.
So I kind of have like a two-parter question as a follow-up to that. So one is like, how do those values and impact areas kind of inform your own work at CS4All? But then as a leader, like how do you also encourage and support other people's values and impacts that might differ from your own within your organization?
There's a great article, which I'll share with you to put on the page below, about culturally responsive school leadership. And the first tenet of culturally responsive school leadership, so not teaching, not pedagogy, but actual like administrators and like leadership working groups in schools, is critical self-awareness. And so being aware of our own internal motivations is the first step towards being inclusive in allowing not only those motivations, but others' motivations to be perceived in the environment. And so we do at CS4All, we actually take the visions quiz ourselves from time to time in our team meetings and talk about what it means. and how it might be influencing our decisions, our communications, and where we as an inclusive organization might be like shifting our course slightly to our own internal biases for outcomes. And so we try to be critically self aware, and I, as a leader, try to be critically self aware with my own staff. For many of the people who've been with me in workshops, I'm often very clear about defining my own positionality on these things. So I will say that my background leads me to feel this is important because, and that does not diminish your background or the reasons you bring to this work. And in fact, I say explicitly over and over and over again in script workshops that it is a little ridiculous that in many places my computer science degree is somehow worth more than the decades of knowledge in the school leaders who come to the script workshops about the schools and communities they're working in. That knowledge of kids, that knowledge of their own buildings, that knowledge of their own communities is way more important than my knowledge of an if statement when it comes to implementing high quality computer science in their schools.
Elevating the voices of people with less power or less cultural capital, however you want to phrase this. So as a director within the nonprofit that I work for, there are power dynamics at play with people that I've supervised or people who are lower on the pay tier, basically. That's probably the easiest way that I can say it. How do you make it so that like they still feel the opportunity and ability and that openness to share their thoughts and disagreements with you or others in the organization while accounting for the fact that like some people might be hesitant because they know the power dynamics at play?
I think something that's really important for nonprofits is to have a North Star. We do this work in service of the community. We do this work in partnership with the community. We do this work for the intended benefit of the community. Now, it may be that someone who reports to me, I mean, I'm the executive director, so someone in the organization has an idea that goes against my own internal feelings. Then they need to come to me and describe how what their idea is in service of the community, in partnership with the community, or for the beneficial outcomes that are part of our mission and vision. And if they can bring that to me, then it's likely I'll bring in other team members. We'll have a conversation. If I have a firmly held belief, then like a really firmly held belief, then it's likely I'll ask for data to support it. And we'll make a data informed decision about what to do next. But I think there's this notion in academic spaces that questioning is good. And I think that can be healthy. Like, how do we question each other and bring diverse perspectives? But in an organization, there needs to be some kind of structure, right?
Right.
I am accountable to our board members, to our donors, to ensure that we are responsible with the funds that we're given, that we meet our mission, and that the things we do fit a whole series of checklists, right, of things you have to do as an organization leader and holder of the budget. And so I used to grade advanced placement exams. And when I was a reader, not a question leader, I would say to my question leaders that I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. I am going to ask all kinds of questions about the rubric. I'm going to bring up weird cases. I'm going to push around the edges. And it's really to help me understand both where this is firm and where it's adjustable and why. Why did we choose to give this half point here and not here? And if we ever get to a point where the questions are just ridiculous or you don't see them as adding benefit, just tell me, because I am your question leader and I say so, and I will stop. And I think there's a time where sometimes an organizational leader has to say, because this is why the money was given to us. And we have a responsibility to enact this in the way that the donor has agreed upon with us in a contract we made 6 months ago. Or out in the national community, right? I can argue as much as I want with the broad community about different approaches to computer science education or the value of orientation PD in excess to the absence of second level professional learning or pathways for teacher mastery, but it's not my job to make a decision for their organization. The best thing I can do is bring my ideas, support them with evidence and data, and we go in front of funders and make our pitches and let the support flow to the places that are perceived to have the most need and best evidence of possibility.
Yeah, I really appreciate that response. It definitely resonates with a lot of things that I believe in and have tried and continue to try and whatnot. Like, education is very gray. Like, there's no black and white in terms of like right and wrong answers. For a lot of research, you can find contradictory research. Like, at the time of this recording, I think it's coming out this upcoming Monday. There's an episode that I'm unpacking some scholarship and saying this contradicts a previous paper that I talked about on this podcast. And it would be interesting to have the authors from both those papers get together and have a conversation about it, because there's many different ways to do it. But ultimately having a North Star that kind of guides, well, which one do you choose and align with? That totally makes sense to me.
And in the world of education too, it's not only that it's black and white, it's black and white and regionally defined. So many people who've, interfaced with me in the past in research circles know that one of the horses I ride all the time is that there's no such thing as a valid instrument. We have instruments with evidence of validity in a particular place for a particular student population at a particular time and context. And so when we bring forth these absolutes, it's almost like saying this program has validity, which we know isn't true. And that's one of the tenets at CS4All. And it's one of the reasons why script is not a checklist. It's meant to be a continuous improvement process where we set a North Star for districts and they build the solutions that move their student population closer to that North Star. So how do we create this environment, this atmosphere in education where there aren't, to your point, absolutes, but instead we're working to the benefit of students. We have agreed upon goals to the best of our ability. We measure our progress to those goals over time and let the really smart professionals who know those kids well and see them every day come up with those solutions that they iterate upon and improve upon over time.
So correct me if this is not a great example of a summary of it, but script is basically a way to help districts think through their own implementation, kind of come up with their plan, think through, okay, well, what do we need to do from administrative support, community support, teacher support, etc. And not being a script facilitator, it comes across as like a heuristic, a tool to think with, not necessarily giving you a well-worn path to go down and that's the only way to go down it, like, but instead presenting multiple perspectives and many different questions to think through. And I don't know if that resonates with like the original intent behind scripts.
1,000% yes. In fact, my favorite part of script workshops is actually like drifting through tables as teams are working. And they'll get to the point where they're reading one of the rubric rows and talking about whether they're emerging or developing. And one school administrator will say, oh, I think we're emerging because we have X, Y, and Z. And the teacher will say, no, we're developing because in addition to X, Y, and Z, we have these other things you don't know about. And then the administrator will go, well, there's this word here that doesn't quite meet what you described. And they're starting to talk about the nuance of their own particular circumstance. And then when they get to the end of the workshop, they've taken all of those nuances, all of those individual goals, and they do priority setting. What's a priority for us? What strengths do we have to build on right now? And how can we build on those strengths to take a next step? And that's what we really encourage districts to do in the script process. Not think about it from a deficit model, but think about it from a landscaping and strength-based perspective as a way to build momentum. Because all of education is a work in progress. Nobody's got it right at the moment, no matter what kind of education you do. And so acknowledging that and thinking about computer science education the same way. It's not that somehow we're going to take 3 steps and be done. We're going to get on a path of iterative refinement and improvement. And we want to build that routine where we're questioning whether or not the choices we're making are truly serving all of our students, whether the policies we're enacting are having equitable outcomes, whether there's a gap that emerges and needs closing, or whether there's a gap that has come before our work that needs closing, all in service of giving kids the best we possibly can.
Now, if we were to zoom out onto CS for All, like as a whole, what do you wish people knew or understood about the organization?
I think the biggest thing that I wish people knew about CS4All was that we explicitly work in service of the community. Our goal is to raise awareness of the need for computer science education to support people being welcoming to all of the different providers that are out there, the initiatives that teachers spin up, right? We build capacity. So we want to resource the local leaders, the organizations on the ground, and really support them. All of it in service of making change for kids. And so we want to be your partner in the work. When we launched CS for All, I found that many of my friends, and Jared, you know, I've been in this community for a long time. A lot of people knew me when I was a graduate student. My friends would call me and be like, "Hey, Leigh Ann, I'm thinking about this thing. Can we just talk through it? What do you know? What are some good resources?" Right? We all have friends who do this to us. And right away, we noticed that that meant that certain members of our community got an outsized chunk of our time because they were willing to reach out to us. And so we created a program at CS for All called Office Hours, which still persists to this day, where anyone can call and request an office hour. And you don't have to have a reason for doing it. You can simply like want to think through your implementation or program, and we'll give you an hour of our time. It'll probably be virtual, and it was virtual long before the pandemic, but it was a way for us to be a partner to the community and really support the work of the community overall.
I didn't know that existed. I love that. Might have to try and implement it at boot up. What's something that has surprised you about either your time with CS for All or with CSNYC?
So I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I came into this space. I used to describe myself as just a high school teacher. And over time, realized that my own privilege of preparation at Carnegie Mellon set me up to understand research really well. And that my own background in education, having been a teacher, a participant in policy initiatives, an interested consumer of all things education and education policy, meant that I had insight. And then finally, as a white woman, that my voice could be useful in advocating for equity, even though my own lived experiences were not the same as many of the students I was serving in New York City. And so overcoming that imposter syndrome and really believing that not only did I not sit quietly in rooms, but there was value in me speaking up in those rooms was something that I had to learn over time.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. Like, because all my degrees are in music education, I came into this with that imposter syndrome because music in particular is very territorial, and the field as a whole, like if you don't have degrees in music performance or music education, they're kind of like, well, why are you teaching that thing? Like, you're not good enough. It's very exclusionary and deficit based. But I've found, at least from my experiences, that the CS Ed community is different. It is very much so strength based in terms of looking at an individual and going, cool, you have a different perspective to bring to the table. Let's chat about that. Not, oh, you don't have a degree in CS, so therefore I don't have to listen to you. So kudos to you, field of computer science education. I actually enjoyed it. So zooming out even more, how has CS education evolved over the past decade, and where do you think it's going?
I remember walking into the first advisory board meeting of the Academy for Software Engineering in New York. And we're in one of the big rooms in Tweed, which is the Department of Education building in Manhattan, which is an old courthouse. So picture these big, beautiful old courtrooms. There is a conference table, like this beautiful mahogany conference table down the middle of the room. And on half of the table are the computer scientists, the Googlers, the Facebookers, the VCs, right? Fred Wilson, Evan Korth from NYU. And on the other half of the table, basically, are the DOE folks. And we're trying to imagine a new high school focused on computer science education. And this work really, there's a lot of credit that has to go to Mike Zemansky for standing up and saying we need computer science themed schools in New York City at that time. And the computer scientists on one side were almost adamant that they wanted to make more Stuyvesant and Bronx science students. that this needed to be a selective high school where you have to pass a test to get into. And if you know anything at all about New York City public schools, that is super controversial and not at all equitable across the city. So on the other side, you have the DOE folks like, no, this will be a non-selective high school. This will be a school that any kid can get into, and it will be a lottery admission process. And you can imagine the rift in the middle of the table. Like, is this even possible? There was a lot of back and forth about how much computer science is rocket science. Could an average New York City public school student in ninth grade even engage in a meaningful way with computer science education activities that weren't like Word and PowerPoint? And telling that story now to you, I think, and to your listeners, they're all shaking their head going, they were so wrong. And that's what we've done in the last decade. We've moved computer science from a post-secondary rocket science into the possibility of age-appropriate instruction and fundamental principles that can be learned by any student. And that, I think, is the biggest thing in the last decade, is just that shift, that there is computer science that you can do in third grade with every third grader.
And where do you see it going over the next decade?
So we spent the last decade really thinking about how to make the concepts of computer science accessible. What is it that we can do in third grade or fifth grade or eighth grade or ninth grade as a part of a preparation pathway? And how do we get kids who, whether they've had no experience at all or some experience, into activities that engage and excite them? That's good. But what I'm hoping for in the next decade is we really think about progressions of learning. How do we not just have your first experience in second grade and then your first experience in third grade? And oh, by the way, welcome to fifth grade. This is an if statement. Thank you for coming to computer science. And then we get to seventh grade and welcome to your first computer science course. It's going to be great because we're going to use Scratch, right? And then we get to 10th grade and we're doing introductory computer science that literally is a rehashing of something that student has done since third grade, right? So how do we really get to a point? And this is where the systems come in, because you can't get to coherent sequences until the whole system agrees that students need pieces of this along the way. And so I think we get to the point of coherent pathways for students that allow them to get to sophistication of knowledge that is age appropriate. And then what's really exciting is we can start to bring in some of the funky things. We can really throw at them, well, here are some of the biggest problems in the world. How does technology contribute to those problems? And what might you imagine or design at this point in your learning journey in order to address those problems? And maybe that means in third grade, students are creating a fun, cute little game about what gets recycled and what doesn't. And in fifth grade, they're thinking about collecting data from local streams outside their school, like they're doing in Ithaca, New York, to monitor pollution. And by the time they get to high school, they're thinking about apps or other intelligent ways to not only collect the data, but use the data to predict what seasons does pollution occur and when would be the best time to schedule community cleanup efforts. And then maybe by the time they're getting to college, they're really thinking about the intersection of all of that with behavioral science, with marketing, with business models, with everything under the sun in order to make a technologically not only literate, but competent generation of problem solvers that'll move our world forward together.
Yeah, many snaps for that answer. That definitely makes a lot of sense to me, especially because of all the bottom-up efforts that are going on, like with the nonprofit that I'm at. Like, we focused on elementary school. And so because kids are now potentially, if it's like a K-6 school, they might have 7 years of going through CS. That means the middle school and the high school, who previously could assume, oh, they probably don't have experience with it, they're going to have to completely change what they're doing. And that's going to make it so that by the time a student goes from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, if they potentially have 13 years of CS experience, like the level of depth that you can get with that is just phenomenal. But one of the problems that I at least had in my districts was they were highly nomadic, in that people were constantly coming in and out of the district and the schools. which is why like I've argued in other podcasts like the Rhizomatic Learning episode that you got to have multiple entry points and pathways that students can take that allows them to go at their own pace along a path that makes sense for them and their own interests. I'm curious about your perspectives on like the corporate influence. So you mentioned like the table with like a bunch of like tech people, and then we have educators, and there's this tendency, especially in like the neoliberal culture, for the corporate influence to say, well, we're providing the money, so therefore we set the direction and the tone. But because your organization is CS for All, those interests of every student aren't likely going to align with the people who are providing the funding in terms of, well, we want future people to work for us. But kids who are taking it are like, cool, CS is awesome, but I don't plan on getting a degree with that. Like,
it's on strong teachers and school leaders to advocate for their students. It's on strong nonprofit leaders to advocate for their theories of change. But it's also on corporations to be clear about what their needs are. Because if for some reason we produced an educational system that did not produce enough computer scientists, that actually would be detrimental to the communities we're also trying to serve, right? There is a part of a global view of outcome where some percentage of the population, and from my point of view, a very diverse percentage of the population, should be engaged in the creation of the technology we all live on. So I think finding the intersection of those needs and values is something we try to do at CSforALL. And part of that is, when I said early on, I introduced how we came to be as an organization, this notion of bringing together the school districts, the researchers, the curriculum providers, the funders, right? Those corporate folks who are bringing computer science education to communities, either through volunteerism, corporate support, through dollars or other means. Then, right, if we're all listening to each other, then it's more likely our goals will be aligned than if we're operating in silos and the only person that each silo hears is the person who's trying to pitch them to buy something or give them money.
yeah, that's a great point.
I want better educated funders. I want corporate America to be better educated about what schools look like and what they need. I want corporate America to be better educated about the problems schools can solve on their own, because administrators and teachers are some of the best problem solvers on the planet. So that if they invest money, they invest things in the challenges that schools can't solve on their own.
So on your Twitter bio, you mentioned that you're an advocate for education reform. If I were to give you like a magic wand and you could just wave it and make one change that had an impact on educational reform, what would you make for that change and why?
Jared, did you read my syllabus when I was teaching Intro to CS Ed at NYU? So there would be this pair of assignments I would give my students. And these were undergraduates or graduates preparing for a minor in computer science education. This was like the first course in the sequence. And I would first tell them that they were king of the world and they could do whatever they want by decree. And so they'd go away in like a half an hour and they'd all like come out with these things in pairs, and they come back and present their ideas. And then I said, great, welcome to the world. You have $5,000. What would you do with $5,000? Because we live in this world of magic wands and constraints, right? So if I had a magic wand, I would create a world where the systems never underestimate any student that's in them, where the pathways in front of every single child were created in a way to help that child live up to their full potential, no matter what zip code they're in, the color of the skin, whether they identify as male, female, or something else entirely. So often we underestimate the youth in front of us. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would simply want us to create systems that allow the youth to get to the biggest potential they could possibly have.
I like that answer. Thank you.
I'm a dreamer, if nothing else.
What recommendations do you have for improving equity and inclusion in CS education?
We value what we measure and we measure what we value. We have to measure it, and we have to be clear about what we're measuring. And so at CSforALL, we have lately started using the CAPE framework from UT Austin. So capacity, access, participation, and experience, as a way to truly disaggregate what we're thinking about when we talk about equity in education. Because if we're only looking at participation rates, then we're not getting the whole story. We launched the Academy for Software Engineering in New York City. That year in 2012, all of New York State, only 2 Black girls took the advanced placement exam. That's in a city with over 400,000 Black girls in the city. And we're talking about the entire state, 2 passed the computer science exam. The only exam that was more difficult for Black students than computer science that year was Chinese language and culture. So the score gap between Black students and their white peers was so large that Black students did better in every other subject than computer science A. We have to look at that. And then we have to not blame that on the student. That's not a call to remediate another kid. That is systemic and structural barriers that prevent an entire student population from being successful in that particular vein. And so I think if we're talking about improving equity and inclusion, there are a million things we can do at each individual level to improve. But most important from my perspective is we have to be clear about what we value. We have to measure it in detail. And then we have to be clear with ourselves when our measurement falls short. We can't just look at the gaps. We have to close them as structural gaps, not one student at a time.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to include in the show notes some links to other podcasts that I've done that specifically talk about some of the gaps, like whether it's in representation of the lack of diversity in teachers or the lack of diversity in curriculum materials, etc. So I'll make sure to link to those.
And we've learned in computer science education that the adage, if you build it, they will come, simply refers to more of the students who are already there.
So how do you iterate or practice to refine your own abilities, either as like an educator or as a researcher or executive director?
This is going to be a super nerdy answer. I consume as much as I possibly can. And so right here on the corner of my desk, I have 2 books you asked about as an executive director leader. So Social Startup Success and Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader, which are 2 of my current reads for myself in terms of growing as a leader of an org. In the pile next to them is Beyond Marginality, which I highly recommend for your research leader audience. So this is Beyond Marginality, Understanding the Intersection of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Difference in Educational Leadership Research by Elizabeth Murakami and Holly Mackey. And it is a collection of articles by researchers outside of the mainstream ethnicities and race. And so Black researchers, Hispanic researchers, Indigenous researchers who speak about the way our methods and approaches and assumptions in mainstream research actually disadvantage those populations from truly telling their stories and having research outcomes that are reflective of ground truth. So I consume as much as I possibly can, and I try as much as possible to participate in the CS education community as a community member, to really hold true to that notion that CSforALL was created for us to listen to each other. And so how am I listening while still at the helm of us as an organization?
So with that listening, though, can come some burnout, whether it's from hearing all of the negative things that are going on and not being able to do much to assist with that, but also just the general demands working as an executive director, working in the field of education, etc. I'm curious, how do you try and prevent that burnout that can come with that openness and willingness to listen and engage in difficult conversations?
It helps to be an internal optimist. I joke that I'm a glass a quarter full kind of girl. I often surprise taxi drivers when I get off of airplanes because they're expecting like grumpy travel passenger. And I'm like, it's a great day. And they're like, what? Why? Huh? And I'm like, it is highly improbable that any day will be the worst day of your life. You only get one of those, but you get a whole lot of days. And so every day holds promise. And while I recognize that in the current place I am in my life, there's a lot of privilege to support that. Growing up, I was a foster child for a short while. And that has really grounded in me to take the things around me that are good, the progress that we make every day, and value it. That doesn't mean you don't strive harder to keep making change, but it does mean you value the small things and the small wins along the way. And I think that is core to who I am as an individual. And I also need to credit a little bit of my house crew. So for those of you who know me on social media, you may have seen at the last SIGC and the last CSTA, I found places where I could go with Maya Israel and Diane Levitt, who are both not only academic colleagues, but good friends. And we literally retreated to a house together. Because when you're listening in isolation to that stew of community that you've talked about, those negative messages, when you don't have anybody around you to unpack them, can be dangerous. And so, how do we find not only our allies, but also the folks that you can be vulnerable with? How do you say, like, I didn't understand that, to someone who's not going to judge you for it? Talk through it. Be able to say, like, I don't have the right language around this yet, but I am thinking about this from this way. Over the last year, I've developed worked really hard to try and develop improvement in my own language about how I refer to Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic people, how to be more thoughtful in the way that I engage other audiences and people whose life experiences is different from my own. And I'm not there yet. I'm still working on it. But it's really, really helpful to me to have someone who I trust where I can try things. And they'll tell me, like, no, you don't want to go. That's not right. And at the same time, to wander in that space together, to think through, like, what are our goals for the world and how do we get there? Or maybe that's not the right particular compass direction anymore, and we have to go 1 degree to the left. But having those sounding boards who understand enough about your professional domain, not just your personal one, that you can live in that camaraderie is really important.
Yeah, that's great that you have that opportunity to do that. For myself, like this last year, it's been a lot of listening to perspectives that I know in advance of that I'm going to disagree with, and actively sitting to try and understand, why is it that you think that way? And where do we align and where do we diverge? And how can we engage in a respectful dialogue through that? And there's been a lot of successes and failures along it. So it's definitely an iterative process for myself, but I appreciate you sharing that idea. I'm going to have to actively seek out some individuals that I can use as a sounding board as well.
A few years ago, I went to a Grace Hopper conference,
Mm-hmm.
and I attended a session about creating your own personal board of directors and thinking about the roles of the people in your life who support your ability to be vulnerable and develop as a human and a professional. And I've always thought about, how do I bring that into my life, into my work, into my projects? How can I be that person for other people, whether it's mentoring someone on my team or providing an interview to a new graduate student? Trying to live in that give and take can be really important in, going back to that eternal optimist, seeing things move forward, whether it be one person at a time, one school system at a time, one state at a time, one policy at a time, one crazy funder at a time, all of it.
What do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
Computer scientists are problem solvers. So we jump in and solve the problems. And we heard 5 to 7 years ago that teachers were the problem. They were the missing widget. We needed more teachers. And so we spun up an entire community to produce more computer science teachers. And along with that, more curriculum, right? More supports for teachers, all that kind of stuff. But we haven't really done computer science education research that exists in the field of educational leadership and educational policy, because those teachers in those classrooms don't operate in a vacuum. And because we've been hyper-focused on teachers, and because our community started with a whole bunch of teacher leaders, we've been hyper-focused on teacher leadership. And I know Jake Baskin shares this opinion that sometimes we ask too much of teachers. If a teacher is fighting for equitable implementation of computer science education in their classroom or building, And a significant portion of their job is getting over the roadblocks that are in their way. What we really need is researching how to get rid of the roadblocks, not how to make the teacher better so they can jump higher. So I look forward to emerging research, which I know is coming, and I know that different folks are starting to really work on this notion of what is the role of school administrators in supporting equitable implementations of computer science education? What is the role of policy, and how does it have an impact on the outcomes that we see at the student level? And where does that policy have unintended consequences? So Josh Childs, who's one of the co-leads of the ESIP Alliance, has done great work in unintended consequences of policy and is really starting to think about that from a computer science education policy perspective. And I think we sometimes treat our education systems a little too simplistically. We have all of this amazing computational power in the world right now to be able to model complex systems. All of the things between that youth and the computer science learning that they're getting, they are wrapped in so many onion levels. We can model that. And we can truly understand what are some of the systemic barriers. What are some of the things that we're seeing in every community across America that are making girls less likely to participate in computer science than boys? Right? That's not a one by one thing. Like, that's happening everywhere. And we're imagining solutions, and we're creating opportunities for teachers to jump a little bit higher to get more girls involved, or for schools to jump a little bit higher to get more girls involved. But we still haven't been able to fix the problem, which tells me it's still a barrier and a jumping problem, right? So I really look forward to us treating the complexity of the educational system as a complex system and not as an opportunity to fix one classroom or one student at a time.
I appreciate the nuances that you shared in that answer. So what's something that you're currently working on that you could use some assistance with?
We're currently working in partnership with the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National AI Initiative to think about artificial intelligence and data science education. And we have a project with the Air Force and soon to be Marines for junior ROTC to think about cybersecurity education. And, computer science as a field is kind of entering its teenage years, its late teenage years, right? It's discovered there's a big, huge world out there. It's trying to get its own sense of fashion. Like, what is it and what does it do? It's realizing that its actions have implications bigger than itself.
Yep.
And it's testing out lots of little different subfields, right? Totally an older teenager, right? And that's rolling down into K-12. So when we started imagining the K-12 computer science framework and the CSTA standards in their last rewrite, we were focused very much on the legacy of algorithmic programming with a smattering of things around it, including like social impacts, networks in the internet, all that kind of stuff. And what we're starting to see is increasing demand for, just as the sophistication of algorithmic thinking and computational thinking has made its way into the lower grades. There's increasing pressure to give students all the flavors of that as a part of engaging them in how this is applied, right? And all the subfields of computer science. So what I would love for our community to share with us great examples of what that looks like. Does cybersecurity education have to be cybersecurity education in standalone structured coursework? Or is it flavors that can be explored through a broad approach to computer science education?
Right.
Right? CS4All has a curriculum portal. We invite our members to submit those curricular examples so that we can get a landscape of what's happening on the ground and be able to tell the story of how it's happening in the field. And for the researchers and leaders out there who listen to your podcast, what does it mean for the way that we're talking to policymakers and school leaders? Do they now have to add cybersecurity to every student's learning trajectory? Do they now have to add artificial intelligence to every student's learning trajectory? They have to add data science to every student's learning trajectory. Is machine learning the next thing? tick, 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 go down the list.
Right.
As we're growing up and as we're getting to this broad thing, are we going to be like the sciences where you study biology for a year and chemistry for a year and physics for a year? Do we keep them siloed? Or is it going to be like the old school computer applications where you would loop through word processing and PowerPoint and spreadsheets, but you would loop through them based upon whatever problem you were trying to solve in the moment or whatever task you're trying to do in the course? And so we need to understand how that's being implemented on the ground, what successes people are having, what creative things teachers and curriculum providers are trying to do so that we can really think about when we're talking to policymakers, we're working with the White House, or making recommendations for what kind of curriculum should be supported by funders who are part of our collective. Like, what's working? What are teachers seeing? I've been out of the classroom for long enough that I don't feel like I have the right knowledge for what the answer to that question is. We'd love to hear from all of you about how you're addressing all these different flavors of computer science education. I invite community members to write for our Medium. Send us an email, info@csforall.org, and say, hey, I want to write an article about, and we'll reach out to you and see if there's a favorite lesson you want to share, if there's a unit you're doing, if there's something interesting you're doing, and we'd love to feature that.
Excellent answer. Yeah, the siloing that's going on within the silo is interesting to kind of witness.
It's exhausting.
Yeah, fortunately, it's not happening as much in the elementary space, but I do start to see it like creep down. It's like definitely in the high school realm and obviously undergrad and grad students, but it's starting to happen in middle schools, but not so much yet in elementary. Give it time. Do you have questions for myself or for the field?
Jared, I think you asked me so many great questions, and I might flip one back on you.
Mm-hmm.
You're a member of the CS4All community. How are we doing as an organization?
So from an outside perspective, there are two main areas that I see working really well with CS4All. One is the ability to connect others, whether it's through the summit or through the commitments and then sharing that across the community or through the website. The other area is highlighting either resources or organizations or people or even ideas that can help kind of guide individuals down a pathway, whether it's like creating like the scripts to help think through a heuristic to figure out implementation, or the visions to help figure out what direction do we want to go in and why, what is the purpose of this. So for me, I see those as two invaluable things that the organization does really well from my outside perspective. So I don't know if that answers your question fully, but like as an organization, I'm glad we have that, because we have like code.org is really good at getting policymakers involved in some way, getting action and change to happen within states, and then providing like the support, whether it's through curriculum or workshops or whatever, to just get teachers introduced to it. And so like that organization is great for that. But what I see CS4All really doing well is the connection and then highlighting and providing resources that really help dive deeper rather than just kind of like some of the more surface level things that I see in other organizations. And that doesn't mean code.org, I just mean other organizations in general.
We all have a role to play in this landscape, right? There's plenty of work to go around. There's too much work for any one org to do it all.
Yep.
We need different organizations focusing on different pieces of the work in order to get to the kind of quality we all hope and dream for kids. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, if your listeners don't know about the summit or the commitments, we have a website, summit.csforall.org, and there's a beautiful commitments visual that's relatively new, where you can actually search over the last 4 years. Can you believe this is going to be our 5th year of collecting commitments? Look at commitments by state, by organization, by year, all kinds of different ways for you to see how computer science education has emerged in your own state or community, and what the trajectory of that's been like over the last 4 years. When we host our summit in October, we'll release the 5th year of commitment data, and we're going to celebrate a little bit of this year of 5 years of progress of the community.
Yeah, I know because like having worked as a specialist in different subject areas in schools, there's like this tendency to feel isolated because you're like sometimes literally the only teacher in your school doing a particular subject. So I see the commitments in particular as a way, like it was kind of equivalent to like having a PLC in my district. So like, oh, I'm actually getting together with other people who do this thing and we can engage in conversations and go, oh, you're doing that? Cool. Well, I'm doing this thing. And from an organizational standpoint, the commitments like serve as that as like, hey, I didn't realize you're doing these awesome things. Check out what we're doing. Maybe we can collaborate in some kind of a way.
And that's, one of the reasons behind them. And it goes back to like our original intent, which was to bring the community together and get them to hear what each other is doing and listen to each other. So I'm glad that they are working in that way for you. And it means that we're hopefully living our mission a little bit.
Are there any questions that I haven't asked that you want to discuss?
I think we've talked a lot about equity and inclusion. And if we're going to really count this as like not just an entry level course, like everybody has their own definition of equity, right? And at CS4All, we're working really hard to think about what does it truly mean to serve student populations with equity? And when we talk about it from a research standpoint or an enacting org standpoint, so think about it like a school district or a curriculum provider, we tend to think about the momentary countables. How many students are in the room? What is the color of their skin and the shape of their butt, right? And how does that represent the general overall population? But education for youth isn't these isolated standalone experiences. They are stackable and parallel and happen in a whole bunch of different ways. And so we're really thinking about equity from a standpoint not only of the data you collect at the moment, but how do you look at it from that 360 view of a child? So I live outside of New York City in Westchester County. There is no doubt that my community has more privilege than others. And my daughter, if I look at her ecosystem, she not only gets an hour of computer science a week in her school, it's one of the specials in her elementary school. She's going into 3rd grade. She also has access to, I think right now it's like 7 different out of school or after school programs that involve computing or STEM in some way.
Oh.
There's a robotics program, there's a coding program, there's a Lego and coding program. The local library has something once a month. The town rec center has something, right? So there's so many things that she can choose from based on her individual interest, right? Which means that she's probably going to find something if she chooses to go that way that will continue to develop that interest into long-term interest because she was excited and engaged in that moment. If we look at other communities, it might be that maybe they have that fundamental standards complete learning pathway in the school, but then there's only one opportunity for a kid to go deeper. Right? One after school program or one weekend activity or one thing at the library. And so how do we look at equity from the perspective of that full wraparound on a student? Do they both have that standards complete minimum bar pathway that we think is important for every child and the suite of opportunities that will let them build off of their personal interests to develop a deeper interest and find computing or computational thinking intersects with their own worldview and the things they want to keep doing. And so we're really trying to think about equity both from a instantaneous measure of participation and from an individual student 360 view. How are we supporting that child so that they can access all of those opportunities, so that their community has all of that around them, so that the parent knows enough to broker for them, as our colleague Rafi likes to talk about, into those activities and help them guide through that pathway so that when they get to high school and there's a choice of whether they want to try the AP class or not, or go into a career and technical education program, or take a digital art elective. They can make that decision with information and then use that again at that next brokering point when they go into college and make a decision about how computer science can impact their lives. And we talk about helping students get over the hump, right? The drop, withdraw, fail rate at university for computer science majors disproportionately affects women and is significantly higher than many of the other degree granting programs and institutions. So if the CS1 and 2 courses are hard and are not disconnected from the real world ways that computer science can impact the world, how do we best prepare a student with enough intrinsic motivation to persist through those? Because they've been able to experience that pathway and suite and opportunities that allow them to persist and have success in later life. So for us, equity involves really not only that instantaneous view, but all of that surrounding things around a child. How do we make an equitable ecosystem from community to community so that your zip code doesn't determine your opportunity?
Yeah, and to build off of that, I mentioned in an episode where I talked about K. Anders Ericsson's discussion of expertise and skill acquisition, which was like what Malcolm Gladwell basically cited to come up with the 10,000 hour rule, which isn't actually a rule if you actually read the research. But like once we get the floor to the point where everybody has opportunity to do it in CS in a school, awesome. But like you mentioned, some schools then have after school. Okay, that's great. So what if we get everybody that opportunity? But the thing to develop that expertise, the next level is, what about at home? Access to devices and to internet. That was really evident in this past year and a half with all the things that went on with COVID and remote teaching and whatnot and learning, is just the understanding of, oh, wow, most of my kids don't even have the ability to log into a device, or they have one device for like 5 siblings and they have really bad internet access. Like that level of inequality compared to like myself, who had full internet access, my own personal computer, didn't have to share it with anyone else. Like that really made it so that I could dive deeper into some areas where my friends could not, because they just simply didn't have that opportunity. So that's definitely something we have to continue to discuss and try and improve in some way.
And very much like the work we're doing with Script, there's not going to be a checklist. It's not going to be that every school or community needs to have these 10 things, right? It's going to be, do students have access to devices and high-speed internet? Are there programs available? Those programs might be offered through the library. They might be offered through a community center. They might be offered through a Boys and Girls Club. They might be offered by the school itself, right? So the question is about like, what is the fundamental underpinning of what makes something equitable? And then how do communities create the opportunity and the resource for that to exist across the landscape? And so it might be that, you know what, there is an iPad checkout at the local library that students can check out an iPad and bring it home. Or for New York City, right, they're putting these New York City, they were for a while putting these New York City links that would project Wi-Fi to a radius from these stands, which actually they put on top of old phone booths. Did you know this?
No.
New York City took all of the like phone infrastructure and created these podiums that basically replaced the phone booths that are Wi-Fi hotspots for communities.
Huh. That's smart.
With screens on them so that if you didn't have your own device, you could actually do a little browsing in real time as well. And it was a great way that they worked on that rather than wiring high-speed internet to every apartment in every building.
Right.
Creating those hotspots was the community-based solution for providing access to, maybe not round the clock, but not everybody needs it when they sleep, but access to high-speed internet to serve the community at scale with some level of speed of rollout versus trying to somehow subsidize high-speed internet into every single apartment building in the city, right? So there has to be community-based solutions that can be creative, but are centered in the community that get to those core principles, that North Star of what we're aiming for in order to claim that there's some kind of level playing field for students as they're making their way through the educational experiences that hopefully launch them into the next phase.
I like how you just brilliantly put a bow, like you wrapped in some previous ideas into that closing idea. So my last question for you is, where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a website, csforall.org, and I think that's your best starting point for connecting with us. You could reach out to us at info@csforall.org, and I actually get that through my inbox. So that does come through me as well. And we'll make sure that you connect either with me or the right staff member for any questions you might have. And we'd love for you to ask for an office hour, share our brain, participate with us in the summit, make a commitment. We'd love to see you. And we're looking forward to bringing the community together around this year's theme, which is Change Happens in Places, at the summit in October.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I really hope you enjoyed this particular interview with Leigh Ann, and I hope you take the time to check out some of the resources in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. If you'd be so kind, please consider adding a review on the podcast app that you listen to this on, or simply sharing this with a colleague who might be interested in this particular interview. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.